From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Peterson, Director of the American Folklife Center, and on behalf of the staff and everyone here at the library, I want to welcome you all today to the latest Benjamin Botkin lecture. The Botkin lecture series allows the American Folklife Center to do a couple of things. Most importantly, present the work of leading scholars in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage studies. It also allows us to enhance our own collections. All of the lectures here are videotaped and become a part of our permanent collections at the American Folklife Center. They also eventually make their way up to our website and our webcasts so that people around the world and people in future generations can listen and hear what you are hearing today. So with that message, just let me ask you, if you have a cell phone or any other device turned on, please turn it off at this point. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing researcher and scholar Ian Nagorski, who is the founder and director of Baltimore's Canary Records. For more than 2 decades now, Ian has been involved in collecting and researching examples of early 20th century sound media, particularly 78s. And in the past 10 years, he's produced dozens of reissues on the music, particularly emphasizing the music of immigrants to the United States. Last year, as part of the AFC Symposium, which is when I first met him, the symposium was documenting culture in the 21st century. Ian gave a wonderful talk about his research on late 19th and early 20th century Greek and Turkish performers and the biographical and sociological contexts of those performances. Today, drawing on Canary Records' recent digital release, and we're sort of moving into new realms here, called Ecstatic and Wingless, Bird Imitation on 4 Continents, circa 1910 to 1944, Ian will explore the largely forgotten art form of bird imitators and illuminate the world of vaudevillians, bird fanciers, and the performers who studied birds, poeticized them, and tried to be them. Before I turn the mic over, I also want to say that this most recent research on historic bird recordings is getting a little bit of notice. Most particularly and recently, it was highlighted by the New Yorker, I believe it was last week, because one of the recordings from Ecstatic and Wingless is a recording of a nightingale made in Bremen, Germany in 1913 and rediscovered by Ian. And it has been selected for inclusion in Moonark, the first permanent art installation on the moon, which is being curated by Frank Racci Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. And so today we're delighted to have Ian join us and talk to us about canaries, nightingales, whistlers and transcribers, birdsong, bird imitators, and the early 20th century recording industry. So please join me in welcoming Ian Nagorski. Ian.
Thanks so much. I'm deeply fortunate, very grateful to be here. What an amazing and strange turn of events in life. As Betsy said, I'm a music researcher and reissue record producer. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, Bird City. My name is Ian Nagorski. I have a little record label called Canary Records. My main project over the past 10 years or so has been on immigrant music to the United States from the collapsing Ottoman Empire. So primarily Greek, Turkish, Armenian, and Arabic-speaking people who arrived in the US end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. Spending a decade swallowing as many stories as possible of the lives of people who immigrated from the Near East to the United States. I have absorbed enormous amounts of material related to their exile, exploitation, murder, ethnic conflict, genocide, you know. And I'm tired. I am. I'm exhausted. The whole thing has beat me up. It's hard. So in response to that emotional problem, 5 years ago or so, I started another project which would try to keep me sane, was the idea. All of my work originates in the process of just digging through detritus, of leftover records that nobody wants. Just junky old remains that are not being actively collected or studied, or if they are, it's only by a handful of basement-dwelling weirdos, my people. So among the records that I was digging through and noticing were, there's lots of them around that say on the label bird imitation with piano or with cello or something. And it was a big popular genre in the sort of first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, where you would get some lady doing a little like twittering whistle bird imitation over top of some guy playing Beautiful Dreamer on piano or some other kind of like sentimental schlock. They're not good records, but the fact that there were human beings imitating animals was interesting enough that when I noticed records of people imitating birds without Beautiful Dreamer or somebody playing a cello or whatever, I said, well, okay, these I'm going to listen to and these I'm going to pay attention to and store those aside. And then gradually I began to notice also recordings of birds themselves lying around in piles. So I said, okay, well, there's something going on here. Why are there records of birds? What purpose could it serve to have a record player in your room and play a record of a bird for fun in 1915, for instance? So gradually I began to dig into this and go down this rabbit hole, and I learned this story, and that's the story I'm going to tell you for the next 52 minutes or so. I will begin the story with a quote from a certain Royal Dixon, who wrote a book in 1917 called The Human Side of Birds. He is vastly more enthusiastic about birds than I am. I actually don't really like birds that much. They freak me out. They are an alien, reptile, dinosaur intelligence that makes me uncomfortable. However, he does get to the heart of a certain kind of personal urgency in the mission of all of this, which is why I want to read this to you. He begins, "It is strange indeed that so few human beings are yet aware of the divine psalmistry of the birds. We pay large sums of money to hear concert music, and we never stop to think that the pieces they're only the musician's ideal of some aspect of nature. In his complex civilization, man has grown away from accord with the world of the wild things, and he cannot give its essence so truly as his feathered brothers of the air. Birds render in their music the glorious spirit of the universe as it really is and ever will be. The indifference of a large part of the human race to the natural beauty that is everywhere reminds one of Stevenson's apt words, 'If God would charge so much a head for sunsets, or send a drum around at the blossoming of hawthorns, perhaps then man would better appreciate and adore what has been his neglected heritage since first his race began.'" So, music, where does it start? My contention is that at every point in the development of music, every change in its technology, there has been a relationship and a dialogue with birdsong, oddly enough. We will start with the first known musical instrument discovered in a cave in southern Germany just a few years ago, apparently made 40,000 BCE. It's a three-fingered flute, plays a pentatonic scale apparently, and it is made from the bone of a bird. So we start there. Okay, jump cut, 25,000 years. The cave paintings of Lascaux include a depiction of a bird-headed or bird-masked man. Jump cut further, 1414 BCE, one of the first comedies ever written, Aristophanes' The Birds, includes the earliest known textual transcription of a bird song, in this case a hoopoe, which goes epoi, poi, 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 epoi, poi, 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 tio, 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 troto, trotio, troto bricks, toro, 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 ticks, kikobau, toro, 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 lilililix. Around the same time, Archytas publishes a diagram of a dove, a mechanical dove, which through a system of cantilevers and pulleys and pipes, not only flaps its wings, but also creates bird-like sounds. It is, in fact, the first robot ever created by human beings, and it is the first lifelike, moving mechanical object human beings ever theorize. You know, he publishes this diagram. It's then republished in a book called Pneumatica in Alexandria, the 1st century AD, and devices are actually built from this, and we have the first bird automata. Through the beginning of the early modern era, into the medieval, early Renaissance, bird robots like this become commonplace in Italy and are part of the gardens of nobility. There is debate among scholars throughout several hundred years whether or not birdsong is actually music. In 2007, Cornell published Sung Birds, Music, Nature, and Poetry in the Latter Middle Ages by Elizabeth Eva Leach, which over several hundred pages tries to answer the question, was birdsong considered music or not in the late medieval and early Renaissance Europe? The short answer is no. It was not seen as rational. Well, times have changed, and rationality seems not to be as important as it once was. From there, we'll jump cut to 1650. The first staff notation transcriptions made in Europe of birdsong occur in 1650 by Athanasius Kirchner. I've given this talk about a half dozen times. People often approach me afterward and say, oh, you know about Olivier Messiaen, this composer of the mid-20th century who cataloged birdsong starting in the late 1940s and then used the material of his cataloging of birdsong to build from, to compose. Messiaen was the dying gasp of a 400-year tradition of trying to notate, trying to take birdsong, control it, manipulate it, and communicate it through the media of staff notation. Okay, 1717, we get to the publication of The Bird Fancier's Delight, or Choice Observations and Directions Concerning Ye Teaching of All Sorts of Singing Birds with Lessons Properly Composed with Ye Compass and Faculty of Each Bird. It is a compilation of tunes for the block flute, for an instrument we call the recorder. Did you have to play the recorder when you were a kid? I did too. Do you know why it's called a recorder? Because it's the instrument that was used to record songs in the minds of birds. The word record, is in fact, it's the core, is the heart. It is repeating over and over so that it is remembered by heart, is what the word means. Anyway, so the recorder was this popular flageolet, instrument used to play to birds, and you would try to train them to sing these melodies. Now, you can do it really well with like bullfinches. It was a big thing. You could train a bullfinch maybe 4 or 5 little songs, and like the Queen of England would pay, you know, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars for one of these birds that could sing 4 melodies. So it is a time-consuming process. You have to, 20 times a day, you have to whistle to the bird, you have to fall in love with it, it has to fall in love with you. And then you sell it to some woman and it won't sing for the woman, and then the man comes home with a beard and the bird starts singing like, oh, I like you. Anyway. So they sold this book to people to try to get people, like, okay, you play these on your recorder over and over again to your bird. There's a half a dozen different birds, linnets and all these things, and your bird will learn these songs. And it was totally just malarkey. It was like a Popeil late-night TV, jive infomercial thing. It was a scam, is what I'm trying to say. It was a scam. However, a bunch of the melodies in that book from 1717 wind up going into English folklore. One, just a few years later, winds up in Gay's The Beggar's Opera. 1810, J.M. Bechstein publishes several textual transcriptions of nightingales that he knows personally in his book, The Natural History of Cage Birds, Their Management, Habits, Food, Diseases, Treatment, Breeding, and the Methods of Catching them. For instance, he introduces one by saying, "This is the song of a fine nightingale, without including its delicate little variations, for among these, as other musicians, there are some great performers, and many middling ones. This song is so articulate, so speaking, that it may be very well written. The following is a trial which I have made on that of a nightingale in my neighborhood, which passes for a very capital singer. Tio, 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 spatio, squap, tio, 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 tiot, 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 tix, cutio, 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 squo, 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 zoo, 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 zee. Cordortio, squa, pipiquip, zradik. Si, 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 si. Si, 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 si. Zorde, 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 hi. Zatud, 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 zi. Glo, 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 glo. Quaitritz. Lo, 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 li, 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 li. And then it gets hard, and I can't do the last 10 lines. I keep trying, and I keep failing. Under Bechstein's influence in 1871 in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin describes attending a canary singing competition in London in a tavern. Like record collectors, canary breeders and fanciers would gather together and show off what they had, get drunk, avoid their wives and children, and would have their birds singing against each other. Now, the singing in modern times is for quality of tone, and we'll be talking about that with canaries momentarily. At the time, it was mainly for one of the few things we know for sure that female canaries, or any bird, any birds like, is stamina. So Darwin says that a first-rate bird will sometimes sing until he drops down almost dead, or, according to Bechstein, quite dead, from rupturing a vessel in the lungs. I don't know if you've known any musicians in your life. I've known a few who match that description quite well. 1896, Charles A. Winchell publishes The Evolution of Birdsong with observations on the influence of heredity and imitation, and includes graphical representation of bird songs, grids of various sized black dots, as well as 37 onomatopoetical words for bird sounds. You can find those on my website, Canary Records at Tumblr. Most of them are not safe for work. It just so happens. Okay, 1896. Finally, we get to records. 1896, the first bird imitation records are made here in Washington, D.C. for Berliner's Gramophone Company. February 15th, 1896, one N.R. Wood cuts a recording called Morning on the Farm. He had to re-record it 5 more times to keep it in print over the next 5 years. In the early days of recordings, the masters would wear out real quick, so in order to keep a record in print, the performer had to go in and re-record the piece. The record company's catalog described the recording this way: a realistic farmyard scene illustrating the different sounds attending the early morning rising on the farm. This reproduction clearly and accurately brings out the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, crowing of the cock, the cackle of hens, squeal of the guinea hen, and gobble of the turkey, all being answered by the cries of the neighboring hawk, crow, and other birds. So real is the arrangement and so exact the imitation that it requires but the slightest stretch of the imagination to place oneself in that delightful position, the result of which is the drinking in of copious draughts of fresh air and numerous other pleasures attainable only on the farm. So, 1896, you have a record player, the last decade of the 19th century, one of the first disc players made, and you have available to you a human being imitating the sounds of farm animals because it gives you an emotional association with the pleasures of the farm. 2 years later, 1898, one Milton M. Clark recorded only one side in his whole career for the Gramophone Company that March, called Imitation of Birds. I have so far not been able to find a copy, but I know that such a record did get made. So those two are the first recordings that we know of on disc recordings. One, Joe Belmont may have released Cylinders earlier, but not by much. Belmont's career lasted another 20 years, actually, doing bird imitation. The first recording of actual birds occurs 1899, made by one Ludwig Koch in Berlin. Ludwig Koch was the son of wealthy financiers, and they were so wealthy that they were able to buy sound recording equipment in 1899 for their 8-year-old son, who then proceeded to record his own pet Indian Shama. Now, that in and of itself probably wouldn't be notable except for the fact that Koch fled Germany during the 30s and landed in London, became a prominent fixture as a newspaper writer and a radio broadcaster. The London Times, May 13th, 1940, he wrote, "War or no war, bird life is going on, and even the armed powers of the 3 dictators cannot prevent it. I would like to advise anybody in a position to do so to relax his nerves in listening to the songs, now so beautiful, of the birds. If one watches carefully, one can be sure of surprises." 1910, another German begins recording birds. His name was Karl Reich. And Karl Reich had already gotten very famous for having taught a canary a nightingale song. It was a big deal in the bird fancier community. He wrote a bunch of articles about it, lectured about it widely. And then he did something else, which was that he taught a nightingale to perch inside the horn of a gramophone recorder, so that he was able to get the first really good, clear recordings of nightingales in particular. He recorded a number of birds. There in Bremen in 1913, this recording that he made of a nightingale has become something of a thing for me. I'm going to play it for you now. How are we doing? Oh, good. Yeah, okay, good. All right, so this is a particular nightingale recorded acoustically in Bremen, Germany by Karl Reich in 1913. Typically, over the years and years of lecturing, I've always tried to not speak over recordings. I've always tried to let them play on their own in respect to the performers, out of a sense of dignity to the lives of those who sang, played. I don't have that luxury today. I got to blast through this stuff really quick. I'm sorry. So this record was an insanely hot seller all over the world. You could go on eBay and get yourself one in like perfect day-was-made condition right now for like $1, maybe $5 if you really wanted to shell out for it. It's all over the place. There are tons and tons of copies of this record. It is junk. It's really good. So, why was it such a big seller? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One of them is because nightingales are found from England all the way through Europe, through parts of northern Africa, all the way through the Balkans, Turkey, Persia, down through Central Asia, down into India and into Indonesia. They occur in poetry from Sappho, Milton, Shakespeare, Homer, Byron, Keats, Shelley, Of course, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of Turkish and Persian poems are about nightingales, particularly the nightingale's relationship with the rose. The nightingale, you see, cannot help but pour forth the most varied, the most elaborate, the most beautiful song of any creature on earth, probably. And when it gets going, during that period in the spring, it will sing all night long. It will go without repeating itself for like 12 hours. It is so much better than Mozart or Ornette Coleman or Charlie Parker. It's like the best outpouring of endless melody. It is the impassioned lover. It is the poet himself. So it's like this perfect metaphor, and it occurs over and over and over again through Western literature of, all kinds. There are no nightingales in the Americas, or in Australia or New Zealand, or anything for that matter. So all of those continents in 1913, 1915, 1920, most of those people had never heard nightingales. They'd read about nightingales all their lives. Here, a nightingale in Bremen, Germany, escapes through records and is sold all over the world to people who now get to hear what a nightingale actually sounds like. Now, part of this was also delightful and intriguing because in 1924, a composer in Italy, Respighi, composed this piece, The Pines of Rome, very famous kind of orchestral suite, thing, tone poem. And he notates the end of the third movement, the last few bars. He writes by catalog number that this record of this nightingale should be played during the last few bars and into the silence which precedes the fourth movement, which is the very first time in the history of music that a pre-recorded sound gets played during a concert performance as part of the piece. I have looked at recent performances and listened to the recent performances, and they do not use this recording, and I object. Oddly enough, there was a reference earlier to this Moonarch project. I was asked to contribute a bird song, and there's a ring that's being inscribed in a titanium object that is 16 microns thick and is the waveform of that particular bird song. As a contribution to that project, the conceptual art project. Part of the reason for that is because of Carl Reich's other claim to fame, which is that he and another guy, Duncker, Hans Duncker, created the first red canary. Canaries are what color? Canaries are green. They are. They're green. They're all green in the wild, all of them. We made them yellow, and then we made them white. And then in about 1920, Carl Reich and Hans Duncker created the first red canary, which people had been trying to make for hundreds of years. And they did it because it was the first genetically modified animal, decades before Dolly the sheep, by splicing in genetic material from a South American siskin. Anyway, that's the other reason that that particular song is going into space. Okay. So, so canaries. Canaries, nightingales were the preeminent songbird all over Europe and parts of the Near East for centuries. They're great. You have them around the house. You catch them at the right time. You really just got a few-week window where the males sing, particularly preceding the arrival of the females. If you, after they've paired, after they've mated, if you take the males, they're still singing. If you take them away, they will go mute and they will die, apparently of heartbreak. But if you get them just in a couple of week window when they arrive before the females do in migration, you can get them to sing for you at home. You have to get a wine glass, and you turn it upside down, and you put mealworms inside, and then you surround that with meat, ground meat. And gradually, because they're going for the mealworms and pecking at the upside down wine glass, they will get some meat in their mouth and they will realize that they can live on that and they like it. So you can keep them around the house. Otherwise, they have to have live food. Also, they defecate wet. So there are pros and cons to having nightingales. This other bird was found on the islands off the coast of Africa, the Canary Islands, they're called, which is their islands are named for a dog. The bird is named for the island, named for the dog. Keep that straight. Canaries, it turns out, sing kind of just as good as nightingales, and their shit is dry, and they eat dry food. So there are like lots of benefits immediately. Also, they're kind of exclusive. So it was like Spanish territory. The birds first go to Spain, and then they get to France, and then they get from there to other parts of Northern Europe. I began looking at canaries and nightingales in particular because I was interested in Greece, Turkey, Armenia, and the Levant, as I mentioned. Part of the impetus was because Greeks have like millions of songs about canaries. Turks have like millions of songs about nightingales. There are like almost no Greek songs about nightingales and almost no Turkish songs about canaries. So there's like an ornithological, ethnological divide. They just split up where they fall along that ethnic bird line. But this is the beginning of it. It's early 16th century. Canaries are imported into Europe, and breeding begins immediately. The royalty start hiring people specifically to take care of their nightingales and begin getting them to sing the appropriate kind of song. Canary song was already radically different in captivity by Darwin's time than it was in the wild. We have taken out a lot of the tropics from their song. All the squawky parody stuff, like that's all gone. Over time, we've developed an ideal canary song by a combination of breeding and tutelage. You see, songbirds learn essentially like human beings, where elders teach younger ones. And so by exposing younger birds to elder birds that you like particularly, you can over time develop and build a line, a tradition of song. So canary song, as it exists now in captivity and has done for 300 or 400 years, is a human composition. So I'm going to play you one of these kind of at its peak. This is a recording made in Berlin in 1937 by the aviary of one F. Blanc. We don't know who he was, unfortunately. But Germany had been the hotbed for canary bird song, in particular for hundreds of years. Villages around the Harz Mountains in particular, you're maybe familiar with the Harz pet food company, comes from bird supply stuff. And the canary in the coal mine comes from the silver mines of the Harz Mountains. Canaries were incredibly common, and there were whole villages where half the population of the village would be involved in canary breeding for export all over the world. So in Berlin in 1937, this record is produced as a commercial recording of a private aviary for home listening. This is not an outdoor field recording bit of nature. This is not Royal Dixon's like vision of like God in the sunset and the blooming of the hawthorn. This is an ideal man-made aviary to be listened to by people who knew what it meant and knew exactly how good it was. Assuming human error. Compounded upon human error. There we go. Now, my background is in electronic music, and it occurs to me immediately how similar this particular sound is to mid-20th century German electronic music. It just so happens. I have no evidence to see a one-to-one correlation, but. Now, in order to create this sound over these hundreds of years, beginning in 1630, there was the invention in France by one Monsieur Bernard, about whom we know nothing, except that he invented an instrument called the sérénette, which is the name for canary. In French, it was a barrel organ, specifically tuned and created to teach a canary an ideal song. So, human man-made instrument specifically for teaching music to birds. Well, then we have the invention of the record player, where we have human beings listening to bird songs at home for various pleasures. And we also have the use of records to teach birds now. We have mechanical recordings to play for your birds. This is one of the records that sent me down this whole rabbit hole, and I'm only going to play you a brief minute of it. It was made about 1920 in Richmond, Indiana, at the Gennett Recording Studios. I don't know if you're familiar with Gennett Records. It was an offshoot record label run by the Star Furniture Company, and a lot of, Jelly Roll Morton recorded there. A lot of kind of foundational blues and country, and a substantial amount of popular music was recorded there. This was a privately made, privately pressed recording made by a Canary Breeders Association in Louisville, Kentucky. And what it is a human performance. Two people, a duet. One's playing a flute, the other one is playing what's referred to on the label as a water organ. I don't really know what a water organ is. I've looked at various designs. I don't see one that correlates to the sound I hear. I believe what it is a pump organ of some kind with little vessels, some kind of bulb of water at the bottom. The air blows through over the surface of the water, causes a warbling sound, similar to the sound of a canary. So this is a recording of these two human beings in 1920 in Richmond, Indiana, to be listened to be played over and over for aviaries of canaries to teach them an ideal song. The record is the same on both sides. Both sides were worn to nothing. So it's a very difficult listen. I'm sure you can take it for a minute, though. So we have a performance of human beings imitating animals in order for the animals to imitate them, so that the animals will be as good as we want them to be, which is like us. Now, at what point did human beings begin imitating animals? I suspect, just a guess, preceding anything we would call music or language. People, whatever people are, were making sounds like their environment, like animals around them. I know some people who can imitate birds. They're all hunters who were taught to do so, not from records, but from like their parents. Human beings have created not just the sérénette, but hundreds of different devices and instruments to imitate birds for various reasons, many of which have to do with dinner. But then there's also the business of entertaining people by sounding like a bird. This is something that, of course, we talked about the Berliner recordings made here in DC, end of the 19th century. It became a thing on records, on early records, such that recording in India began in 1906. In 1908, there were already recordings made in India by bird imitators. The first one was one Venugopala Chari. This one is a recording from about 1920, just to give you an idea.
थोड़ा गौर से सुनिएगा ये इंसान होकर परिंदों की बोली की सिफत के साथ सुना रहा है। अच्छा बेटा, मौसम बहार में कोयल दरख्तों पर क्यों कर चहचहाती है? अच्छा बेटा, मुर्गी अंडे देकर अपनी कोठरी से कड़कड़ाती हुई क्यों कर बाहर निकलती है? अच्छा बेटा, मुर्गा सुबह को क्यों कर बांग देता है?
When you tell your friends what you did with your hour at lunchtime on Tuesday, will they believe it? All right, so here's another bird imitator from about 1910, 1909, something like that, from the Alhambra Music Hall in Paris, France. This is a trained professional, self-trained. Through the teens and 20s, there were dozens, if not hundreds of people who made their living, partially at least, from imitating birds on stage. I'm going to play for you two in particular from America that I am especially fond of. The first one is significant because it represents a new moment in the history of women in America. Parallel with the suffragette movement through the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, it became possible for a woman to stand in public, pucker her lips, make weird faces, and whistle in front of other human beings for the first time in American history. There are literally hundreds of articles published between the last decade of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century that begin with the old saw, which I'd never heard before. A whistling woman and a crowing hen never will come to any good end. And then the article goes on to say, well, can you believe it? Not anymore. Now women can whistle too, and it's perfectly okay. And here's a lady who's coming to our town, and she's going to whistle for us, and it's going to be great, and you're going to like it. For instance, there's a San Francisco Chronicle article from June 26, 1904, called Whistling is an Art and Drawing Pretty Lips to a Pucker, and begins with this quatrain, boys may whistle, but girls must sing. Now I call that a curious thing. If boys can whistle, why can't girls too? It's the easiest thing in the world to do. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, April 15th, 1915, when Dr. L.K. Hirschberg, A.B., M.A., M.D., of Johns Hopkins, wishes to reassure you that your daughters and wives will in no way be harmed by whistling. He says thus, the hygienic advantage of whistling is only beginning to be recognized by psychologists and public health officials. Most medical men, however, especially in the strict laboratory kind, scoff at the very idea. Yet, as an aid to health, whistling is the equal of most muscular exercises and far superior to medicines, mud baths, and morbid medicamentations. It's science, folks. It's perfectly okay. Now, so women began publicly whistling and doing bird imitation in particular. One woman named Agnes Woodward opened the California School for Artistic Whistling. It was one of several schools of artistic whistling opened around the country about that time, and it graduated the two most famous whistlers, female whistlers of the early 20th century. One of them, his name I've forgotten, but you know her, you've heard her, because she sings in the first 5 Disney feature films. Snow White at the wishing well, I'm wishing, and the little bird in the tree whistles the melody back. That's that lady. And she's not credited in any of the films because it's Disney and that was what he did. But anyway, she was a graduate of Agnes Woodward's California School for Artistic Whistling. The other most famous female whistler of the early 20th century was this woman, Margaret McKee, who was born 1898, started performing as a whistler at the age of 9 before studying with Agnes Woodward. Performed at churches, ladies' functions, private homes, 1915 to 1918, including at Chautauqua. Are you familiar with Chautauqua? It's a similar situation as this, right? It's, yeah. So it's infotainment. Somebody gets up and does something entertaining and, gives you a talk about how you should live a tempered life, or ladies get dressed up like and do, tableaus and togas of Greek sculpture and stuff. Yeah, it's similar to this kind of nonsense that I'm doing right now. So she does that. By 1921, she performed at the Hippodrome in San Bernardino, California, where she was lowered from the rafters in a giant cage dressed in yellow feathers. She toured Europe from 1922 to 26, and then returned home first to California and made radio broadcasts, and then toured around, opening for Our Gang movies in Reading, Pennsylvania and stuff. Until 1929, when she struck up with a Brooklyn Baptist evangelist named Russell Brower, with whom she performed twice a week, every week until 1935, for 6 years, opening for lectures titled The Virtuous Life and Suicide, Is It Ever Justifiable? She returned to California after those 6 years, still with her maiden name, and went back to live with her parents, recorded into the 30s and 40s at ladies' teas and women's functions. She was a great virtuoso of whistling and made many, many records, accompanied and unaccompanied. This is a little sample of one from the late 20s, one of my favorites. I really like Margaret McKee. How are we doing on time? Okay, 10 minutes.
Song Sparrow. The red-winged blackbird. The plump little California quail. The linnet.
So, for what it's worth, Agnes Woodward, her teacher, published in 1937 a book on artistic whistling, half of which is dedicated to bird imitation specifically. So that book is probably here in the library somewhere. It's available online for free. I do recommend it if you're interested in pursuing the subject, as very few people seem to do anymore. Why do people not imitate birds so much anymore, and why are there these old records of them? The question is, okay, so old records, the deal was when there first was a record business. You would put on a record, and if your ears were to be believed, there was like the sound of a human voice or someone playing an instrument or something, and yet you could not see them. And so for people who for millennia had been trained from infancy to expect a sound to be accompanied by something that you can see, a source making that sound, it was a dissociative feeling and a source of wonder and joy for a great many people. Similarly, if a person is standing on stage and the sound of a bird is coming out of a person, it is a similar dissociative experience and kind of amazing, kind of, wow, you sound just like a whatever animal it is. So the two kind of cancel each other out. You put on a record, you can't see the person causing you the wonder because the wonder is the record, and then people became desensitized to that wonder. Well, it still goes on privately in various places. There are still bird imitation competitions in various places. There have been a couple of TV stars. There was a guy about 20 years ago in Italy who made a name for himself on like Star Search type shows doing great bird imitations. But he was not as good as Charles Kellogg. Charles Kellogg was the best there ever was. And he got very rich and very famous imitating birds, among other things. So I'm going to try and tell you real quick the story of Charles Kellogg, who I could have spent this entire hour on. I love Charles Kellogg. Charles Kellogg was born October 2nd, 1868, in a small town in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. His father ran a provision store for gold miners. His mother is out of the picture by the time he's 2 or 3 years old. We don't know where she went. We don't know if she died or abandoned the family or what. But anyway, she's gone. And Charles and his brother are mainly raised by a Native American woman and a Chinese guy. So he grows up actually around very little English language for a lot of the time. And furthermore, he spends pretty much all the time of his childhood, up until he's 9 years old, out in the woods by himself. And he teaches himself during that period to do this thing with his throat, where he would make the sounds back to various animals, snakes and bears and birds and all kinds of stuff. He developed a way of singing with his mouth closed and imitating animals back. Now, his father grew alarmed when he got to be about 9 years old that he was kind of growing up this wild boy, and he sent him out to upstate New York to live with rich relatives. They taught him woodworking. They, taught him how to, sit at the dinner table. They sent him to Syracuse. He graduated, during which time he started a men's choir, liked singing. Just after graduating from Syracuse, he performed at Chautauqua. And he was a hit. What he did is he got up on stage and he did this thing he'd learned how to do as a kid, where he would sing like a bird with his mouth closed. And people went like, that's great. And he went, I've got a career. And he went on tour. And he toured relentlessly for the next 50 years. Where to begin? Okay, so we got to plow through Charles Kellogg. So Charles Kellogg, what he would do, he'd come out on stage. The backdrop is painted to look like the woods. He comes out dressed like a woodsman. He's got this mustache. He's really good looking. He looks like a Brooklyn hipster. He's like super cute. And he comes out, and this bird sound is like coming out of his throat as he comes out on stage with the woods behind him. And people are going like, wow, that's amazing. And then he stops and he begins to address the audience, and he tells them all about nature and how wonderful it is. And if only you just go into the woods and approach the animals without fear and with love in your heart, everything will always be fine. Now, I told this to my daughter at one point, who's 10 years old at the time, and she said, is that how he died? His big break came in a San Francisco Call article, December 4th, 1910, after he'd already been touring for about a decade. In that, the writer writes, he has the utmost faith in the power of love and kindness. It is all love, he says. Anybody who goes into the woods with the spirit of love in his heart, without the faintest desire for destruction or possession, can make friends with the birds if he is merely tactful and patient. Birds can read the hearts of men better than men can. They know their friends, and they're ready to love them. In Kellogg's mind, there is no place for fear or hatred. Fear creates fear. Hatred breeds hatred. Love engenders love. These are the cardinal tenets of Kellogg's creed. So that's what he does on stage. He lectures you, sometimes for like 2 hours, about love, while he's like intermittently doing demonstrations of bird sounds, or taking out snakes and having children come up on stage and play with the grass dollies, he calls them. And And then the topper, okay, so apparently he'd gotten his hands on an early edition in English of Hermann Helmholtz's On the Sensation of Tone, a book on acoustics, foundational work. So apparently he'd read this and it sort of blew his mind, and he got this idea of an experiment that's in Helmholtz's book. So he gets a gas flame Bunsen burner and a glass tube, and he demonstrates that by just using his throat and the vibrations of the air, he can make the flame dance. And then he can blast a note so high and so loud that you can't hear it, but it extinguishes the flame. And that's the end of the show, folks. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Kellogg, and the house goes crazy. Nobody had ever heard of it. So he's fascinated with vibration and love and fire and animals, and it's all this one big package. And he just tours it relentlessly, and he knows how to keep the press and the media interested. By 1915, 1920, when he's playing in Chicago at the big theaters, he's making the equivalent of $100,000 a week, like Oprah money. Then one of the heiresses of the Kodak fortune seems to fall in love with him. She piles a bunch of money on top of him. He builds this house out in the mountains called the Mushroom, which is a single room with an open roof and a fireplace on a track on wheels that can go around. He's a vegetarian his whole life. He never takes a gun into the woods with him, ever. Takes lots of photographs. When the interest in his work starts to fade in the 20s, he goes to the redwoods. He cuts a giant section of a tree and carves it out with a couple of axemen, builds a room inside the tree, mounts it on the chassis of a tank, and then drives it. It'll only go 7 miles an hour. Drives it down the West Coast, up and down, making whistle-stop tours, no pun intended, telling people about the woods and birds and how great he is, and he calls the vehicle, there's been no such thing as a RV before, remember, in 1925, he calls it the travel log, har, 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 har. Anyway, okay, so I'll play you some of Charles Kellogg. Among Kellogg's various claims that he would make was that at first he said he had a 9.5 octave vocal range. And then he changed that. He said, no, he had a 10.5 octave vocal range. In any case, it was enormous, whatever it was. He also claimed, as you will hear, to have the actual physical larynx, the syrinx of a bird in his throat, which was such total baloney. However, he did also claim, and this is true, he spent a full day with Auguste Rodin, who who was crazy about Kellogg. And even though they didn't speak the same language, they hung out all day and looked at art and had dinner and smiled at each other, apparently.
Most people who listen to the singing of songbird songs fail to notice that all songbirds sing in the ecstatic mood and not in the lyrics. A good example is that of the catbird. The call of the stormy peacock or mother carries chicken is heard from out of the farm. The first bird voice that greets me in the spring of the year is the cardinal redbird, calling, "What cheer, what cheer, what cheer?" Ending with a loud call, the first jenny wren or house wren pours out its voice in undulating trill.
The whole record is 4 minutes on the side, so I'm going to skip ahead. I just want to play a little bit of the end.
From over the lake on the moonlight. Another one on the other side of the marsh will say, "What for? What for?" Another will say, "Well, well, well." What?
My sentiments exactly. So, just to finish up real quick, I just want to say that May of 1929, the first recordings of birds are made in the wild, the first non-captive, non-caged bird recordings by Arthur Allen from Cornell's Ornithology Lab, made on film. 1932, Albert A. Brand issues a 12-inch 70 RPM disc set called Bird Songs Recorded from Nature, recorded outdoors with a parabolic microphone. And this, folks, is about where captive bird recording ends. From that point on, we have various recordings of folkloric examples of bird imitation. So, for instance, Friday, May 6th, 1938, here in Washington, D.C. at the National Folk Festival, Fred Colby's group from Nashville, Tennessee, includes a recording of a bird imitation. It's not very good. William Lipkind records bird imitation in Mato Grosso, Brazil in 1938. Those recordings are housed at the Indiana University Archive of Traditional Music, et cetera, et cetera. The last one I'll play for you today, though, was recorded at Arvin, California's California Farm Security Administration camp by one Charles L. Todd for the Library of Congress's Robert Sorkin Migrant Workers Collection under the WPA. This is Donald Leach, recorded August 24th, 1941. He imitates a variety of things. Birds are just part of it. But he's one of the better performers, I think. And he was 6 years old at the time. Oh, beg your pardon.
This one's a frog. Right turn. Chicken. Turkey. No.
All of which is to say that there is such a thing as joy and wonder in the stuff that gets left behind, the junk that nobody wants, the stories that are not so important to the central narratives that we continue to tell ourselves about who we are. We're actually much better, weirder, more interesting, and more fun than what we claim to be. You've all been very kind and patient. Thank you very, very much. Thanks. Nancy has asked if, first of all, if anybody's got to go, like, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Perfectly fine. I know there's, life goes on. Nancy's asked if anybody wants to ask a few questions. I'll try. Yes?
Well, I've been listening to our recordings here at the American Folklife Center for a long time. One of the best-known French traditional folk songs, and it's sung everywhere where French is spoken, is called Rossignol Sauvage, which means wild nightingale. And the trope of the song is the lover asking the nightingale to teach him its language so that he can woo his girlfriend, right? Because the nightingale is so good at that.
Right.
And so, that gets into this question of bird imitation and why people would do it. That's one sort of traditional answer to the question. And I wonder, in others, you mentioned that, for example, in Turkish songs, there are many, many songs about the nightingale. What it is about the nightingale that's being discussed?
Oh, there's a million things about nightingales. Okay, so in the Turkish-Persian tradition, nightingale sings to the rose. Male sings to female. It's a metaphor of masculine desire and ability to speak to. Now, also, nightingales nest low to the ground, sort of in briars and bushes and stuff. And so there's this long tradition of the idea of them intentionally piercing their own breasts with thorns out of, like, the agony of love. So there's that. There's another whole tradition having to do with the fact that they do sing all night long. So they are worried, they are unrestful, they're looking out for something, something's bothering them. There's one story that nightingales originally only had one eye, and worms had one eye, and the nightingale borrows the eye from the worm, and then doesn't give it back, and then has to stay up all night watching out for the worm, because the worm's going to try and come back and get his other eye. Yeah, so, what is it about ache and yearning? I mean, the song is thought of as sad, and, I can hear why. But there are all these projections. Nightingales are also, remarkably, one of the least interesting looking birds. I mean, they are as boring and drab as you can get. They're brown and middle-sized and just nothing looking. And they sing the best. So there's all this other stuff about, God sort of gave colors and all these great things to all the birds, and the nightingale was last in line, and he said, well, I'm all out, you get song instead. So all that kind of stuff. Like there's so many stories. There's a Bulgarian story that came up earlier about a woman who makes a bet with a nightingale about who can sing better. Oh, I beg your pardon. Thank you. What is her name again? Mag? Dragana. Thank you. Yeah, I can't remember the story.
He challenges her, and he says, if you lose, you have to cut off your hair, and if I lose, I'll cut off my wings.
Right.
And she wins.
Right, but she doesn't cut off his
But
wings
she doesn't.
because she's nice.
She says, I have little ones,
Aha.
and she was.
Yes.
Behold.
Yes.
So are they known for being competitive and vain? I mean, is it...
Nightingales?
Yes, are they thought to be competitive and vain?
No, they appear, not that I can't think of an instance of that. They appear in Aristophanes' The Birds and in the Conference of Birds. In both cases, they're lovers who want nothing to do with conflict. They're like checked out and only want to love, and that, So, yeah.
So nightingales are connected with romance and passion.
Hmm.
Where are canaries known for? Within Greek song, you said that they're
Oh, yeah, right. Well, they're companionate. Say that nightingale are also what ends the idea of recording a companion nightingale. Does that answer your question? Yes.
How does the lark sound? There's a poem and the lark will fly up and sing, and I'm always curious how it sounds.
The Cornell Ornithology Lab contains a massive archive of recordings of lots and lots of birds, and it's all available. Hundreds of thousands of them are available for free online. I cannot recommend highly enough. It's such a great resource for listening to any kind of bird song. I can't imitate any birds, so I can't do it for you. I wish I could.
And this is only in England.
Yes, the lark, yeah. I'd never heard a nightingale before myself until I was in Germany in April several years ago, and it was remarkable walking down the street and immediately going like, I know what that is. Oh man, this is really happening. I'm really inside of this life.
It flew up in it's early dawn, right? Because my professor
Lark of the morning.
He always,
Yes. Oh yeah, Vaughan Williams. Yeah.
He always hears it when he comes back from partying.
Yeah. Those associations are important. There's a line in Dante in the Purgatory which is Lord, I can't remember what the line is, but in Latin, it's actually onomatopoeia for a blackbird singing in February too early to hasten along the spring. So it's layered with not only the literal meaning of the words themselves, but also with the association of the onomatopoeia of the bird. There are these things that kind of occur in poetry and the onomatopoeia of all the bird songs that are kind of fun. So.
I'm sorry we're running out of time, but I want to thank Ian Nagoski again for a great talk, and
Thanks very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.